So, as everyone will have heard in the intro, we're here today with Kyle Buller, the co founder of Psychedelics Today, along with Joe Moore, who we had on a few months back. Psychedelics Today is an online psychedelic and breathwork education center. And the first thing that I wanted to bring up was that this podcast was actually birthed from the integration project of your course, Navigating Psychedelics. And for those of you who don't know, last year I took this course, Navigating Psychedelics for Clinicians and Therapists through Psychedelics Today. And at the end, there's a project where the students are required to either put together a physical piece of art or some sort of physical project or do some sort of development plan for how we're going to move forward in this world while integrating the stuff that we've learned in the class. So my project was the planning and the development of this podcast. So along with thanking Joe, I'd like to thank you for igniting the fire and for coming on the show today, Kyle.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and well, thank you for showing up, right? Because the project wouldn't have taken off if you didn't engage in it. So I think that was the point of the project. So yeah, it's so cool to see it manifest. I think that's like a really important lesson when it comes to integration. How do we really move these experiences forward in our life? And yeah, it's cool to see it manifest on your end finally.
Yeah, and I mean, I learned a lot. And I know that people that I was in the class with also learned a lot. And one of the most memorable things in the course for me personally was when we had like our live sessions. And the one live session, you had told everyone about your near death experience, which I understand was sort of like your first like journey into transpersonal states, big, gigantic, mystical type experiences. So, would you mind telling that story again in as much detail as you feel necessary?
Yeah, sure. Um, was 15 and I came across this book called Snowboarding to Nirvana, and I read it during my winter break of my freshman year of high school. And I think we had kind of had to do like a book report, but it was about this guy who went over to Nepal and ran into this Buddhist monk. And the monk brought him in and taught him transcendental meditation. And so in the book, they had all these kind of meditation techniques, and I started to kind of incorporate it. And the way that the person was incorporating it into their life in the book was that they were trying to really enhance the flow state of snowboarding. And I was like, wow, this is cool. So I remember trying to enter into flow states. I was a big swimmer back then. And so like I would think about like the visualization, trance states while I'm swimming to kind of access like another kind of state of consciousness, see if I could do a little bit better. And then I always kind of joke around about a year later. I say I kind of snowboarded to Nirvana. So yeah, as you mentioned, I had this pretty big near death experience. So I was 16. It was a year later. Yeah, it was during winter break. It was New Year's Eve. And I didn't really want to go out and party with my friends. I wanted to go snowboarding. So me and my brother and his friend went out to hit the mountain. And my brother's friend fell. He kind of banged his head a little bit. It wasn't anything serious, but it just kind of shook him up. And we went inside the lodge, and I said, we just got here. Let's do one more run. I was like, you don't have to go out, but I want to do one more run. And they both decided that they would go out. And if you ski or snowboard, I guess I learned this afterwards, but you should never call your last run. um, so I tried to plan out the longest run on the mountain, taking multiple trails and just saying, okay, I would be content if I can do this. So during the day, it was really warm that day, and so it created like a kind of a slushy type of snow. And then by the time it was nighttime, I was doing some night snowboarding in the Poconos in Pennsylvania, and it was turned into like that granular type of ice, and there was just mounds everywhere. So it's like the warm kind of slush got all kicked up, and then it starts to freeze at night, and you're just left with kind of like these like little icy granular mounds. So I was going around this turn, and it was this trail called the Nile Mile. And it was kind of just like a big snake, and so it had these big kind of like S turns. And I was going around the second one, and I was going pretty fast. I was on my toe edge, and I was coming out of this turn, and I saw this mound of snow, and it was kind of being shaded by the light. And when you're going around the turn, there's kind of a blind spot. Like you're kind of turning into things that you can't always see. And so when I came out of it, I noticed this mound of snow, and the immediate thought I said, "Oh shit! If I hit this, I'm going to die." So I tried to turn, I tried to stop, I tried to do everything I could, and everything started to slow down and started to go slow motion. And so I hit this mound of snow, and then time seemed to speed up. And I flew through the air, I guess, about like 30 feet or so. And I think my brother was behind me, and they said I wasn't very high in the air. It didn't like launch me high, but it was just I was going so fast. It was just kind of like a long type of, it shot me long and far. So the nose of my snowboard hit, my shoulder hit, and I heard a loud pop. And I immediately lost like air. I was gasping for air. I just started screaming, kind of like these deathly grunts. And I slid down the mountain for a bit. And when I stopped, I was in so much pain. I heard this loud pop, and my immediate thought was I snapped a rib. So my brother and his friend came. They said, "Are you okay?" I said, "There's no way I can get up. I'm really like badly injured." So they said they would go down and get somebody. So I'm laying there in the snow, face down, kind of having these deathly grunts, like and like because I'm can't really breathe, and I'm just having all this pain in my chest and my stomach. And I'm watching like all these people just whiz by me. Nobody's stopping. Nobody's seeing if I'm okay. And then these two punk ass snowboarders, thank you to whoever you are, um, they stopped and they asked me if I had a light because they wanted to smoke a cigarette. But they said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "No." So they put their snowboards in front of me and hung out with me, thankfully. So, they went up the trail a little bit, blocked it off so people weren't coming out of that corner, kind of like what I was doing, full speed, and then, possibly running into me. Um, I was probably there for about like 30 or 45 minutes. And my brother came back with his friend. And he said, "They're not coming for you." And I said, "What do you mean they're not coming?" And he said, "I don't know. We mentioned that you were hurt." And the lifty just kind of like shrugged it off and didn't really say much. And so I was just like, "Oh my God, like, what am I going to do?" Luckily, it's a small resort. Ski patrol is always kind of patrolling. A random ski patroller came down, asked me if I was okay, told him I was pretty hurt. He tried to take my vitals, and I remember trying to take my pulse because he like couldn't feel my pulse. And they got a sled. They hooked me up to the toboggan, and then in the background, I guess my dad told me this story. He was at the bar, just hanging out, waiting for us kids to be done. And I guess another kid came in and went to their father. Said, "Oh man, there's this guy like really hurt on the Nile Mile. He's dying." And my dad was like, "Oh, it sucks for that kid." And then like a couple like minutes later, my brother came in and said, "Kyle is really hurt." So they got the toboggan, they brought me down, got me to first aid, and they started to check my vitals. They're checking my pulse. They're doing everything. I told them, I heard this pop in my chest, and I'm in a lot of pain. And they said, "Your ribs are fine. There's no bruising. Nothing's cracked. Doesn't seem like there's anything wrong, but your pulse is really low, and we think you have internal injuries. You look really pale. Like, are you typically this pale, or do you typically have a low pulse?" And I'm thinking, I don't know, maybe. Um, and they just said, "Yeah, we think you have internal injuries." And at that moment, I just remember going, "Oh shit, I'm gonna die tonight." And I wasn't very religious growing up, but I started to pray. I just remember going, "God, if you're out there, I do not want to die." It was scary. I was terrified hearing that, and I just found out a few years ago. My dad was recounting part of this story with some other folks, and I guess so. Thankfully, they got a helicopter and medevaced me out. They put me in an ambulance to bring me to the helipad. But I guess as they got me to the ambulance and were getting me in there, one of the first responders looked at my dad and said, "Your son's in his golden hours, and he may not make it." And I think that scared the shit out of him. He told me he just like did like a hunt, like just drove to the hospital so quick. Um, my uncle was actually a first responder in that county, in that township. And so he met me there. And I remember when I was on that being medevac, my phone is just like blowing up nonstop. Like all my friends are calling me. They're found out, yeah, they were really pissed that I was just ignoring their calls. I was supposed to like meet up with them for all these New Year's events. Um, so my uncle was there, and he looked at me, and they're again checking my vitals. They're trying to take off my clothes, take off my snowboard boots. I'm trying to help them, but I remember my uncle said, you're in good hands. I know these people, and you're going to be okay. And at that moment I had this weird thought where I was looking at him, and I said, this is somebody that's family, blood related. um, but about where I'm about to go, I can't take anybody with me. Like, this is my own journey. And that was like a really interesting thought to have, of like, this, I'm just going on this journey by myself, and I can't bring this physical person with me. So yeah, they're checking my vitals. I'm hearing in the background, like, we can't get a pulse on him. His veins in his upper body are collapsing. They're just jabbing me with needles, and because they can't like get into my veins to get the IVs in. I think they jabbed a huge one in my femoral artery. I remember my uncle being like, "That one scared me. They pulled that one out, and I just felt so bad for you." So it was a pretty big needle going into that part of my thigh. So I'm hearing all this stuff, but nothing is kind of like, bothering me. I describe it as like, it was like I entered into this like oceanic, like, field of empathy. It was just like I tapped into something where I could feel all the emotion in the room. I felt like I was across the room with like all the doctors, the nurses. I was feeling into all this stuff. And I was also having my own experience. So then, after they checked my vitals, tried to get me tapped up with IVs, they did a sonogram on me, and they told me, this is why you feel really sick and why you have all this pain in your stomach. You have massive internal bleeding. Your abdomen is just filled with blood. And we need to figure out where this bleeding's coming from. So they said, we need to take you to the CAT scan machine, and try to figure out what's going on there. So they brought me over there, and as I was in the CAT scan machine, things really started to kind of take off. I remember just laying down, cold, as just so cold. I'll never forget that feeling. I had like no blood circulating through me. It felt like I was just submerged in a tub of ice water, and I remember just sitting there shaking, in the CAT scan. And I could hear the doctor on the other side on the intercom. He just kept telling me, "Kyle, don't fall asleep. Don't fall asleep. Stay awake. Be with us." Um, and in my mind, I just was kind of like going, "Oh, I just want to go to bed. Like, I'm so tired. I'm so cold." And they're trying to instruct me, take a deep breath in, for like the CAT scan instructions. And I'm just thinking, I can't do anything. I just want to drift off. And at that point, I kind of describe it as like this white light, golden light. There's like some sort of orb around me. And there is this voice, and I don't really know how to describe it. I don't really remember it being an external voice. It felt more of an internal voice, or like a deep sense of knowing. And this voice said, "You're going home. You're going back to the stars where we all come from. And this physical life's going to cease to exist, but you'll continue onward. And the more that you struggle with this process, the harder it's going to be. So the more that you can ease into this experience, the easier this transition will be for you." And I just remember feeling completely blissed out and going, I kept thinking, I'm going home. I'm going home. Like, this is what we all wait for. And in the meantime, the doctor is telling me, "Don't fall asleep, don't fall asleep, stay with us." And I'm just thinking, like, no, this is it. This is what we all wait for. And I felt this just total bliss and love. And so they wheeled me out and told me, "You just ruptured your spleen. You have massive internal bleeding. We need to do surgery ASAP." So they wheeled me to the OR, and they're explaining what was going on. I'm completely like out of it and slipping away, and kind of, yeah, fading out. And the last stuff I remember hearing was they were trying to describe, giving me, an analgesia, like anesthesia. And they said, "We're going to count backwards, this and that." And I just heard one of the doctors say, like, I think they were talking about trying to shave my chest. But the last words I remember before blacking out was, "Should we use an electric razor or a straight razor?" and then I blacked out. And I woke back up as they were wheeling me to the ICU. And I remember as they were wheeling me through there, it was like my spirit like jumped back into my body and I shot up from the bed, and just started shaking violently. And in those like split seconds, I remember hearing, "He's awake and he's cold." And then I just like passed out and then woke up in ICU with my family around me. And I was pretty aware of time. I remember waking up and going, "Is it New Year's Eve?" And they said yes. And I said, "Did the ball drop?" And they said, "No, it's 9:30." I'm like, "Oh wait, this all happened at like 7:30." And then I just remember I was so parched, and I one of the first things I said was like, "Green tea, can I get green tea?" And one of the nurses was standing there and said, "You can't drink anything, Kyle." And I just remember going, and I passed out for the rest of the night. I couldn't cope with not being able to drink anything.
Wow, it's an incredible story. And you said you were in the Poconos, right?
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
like 20 minutes from where I live. They may have even
Oh,
taken
no
you.
way.
I live right down the street from a hospital, Lehigh Valley Hospital. They may
They
have
brought me to
taken you.
They brought me to St. Luke's.
St. Luke's, yeah, right down
Yeah,
the road. That's so
and so
funny.
I was, snowboarding at Camelback.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Wow. It's so crazy. Every time I hear stories of near death experiences, or I was reading this book, I think it was called Awake by Dr. Bruce Grayson.
Mm,
I think he's like the foremost leading doctor who studies near death experiences. And every time I hear about them, it seems that psychedelic experiences and near death experience sort of validate one another. They're
mhm.
like within the same realm. So, how close was your first mystical psychedelic experience to your near death experience?
Yeah, so I was around 19, I think, when I had my first one of my first psilocybin experiences. My first psilocybin experience was probably like what we would classify as like a museum dose. It was pretty low, and it was interesting. The walls were a little breathing, and it was fun. I remember laughing, but that experience definitely would not prepare me for what I was about to experience with this first, really, really powerful psychedelic experience. I had some experiences with cannabis beforehand, and I think that was somewhat helpful to kind of prep me. Um, so yeah, I think I was 19, and I kind of took it. So after the near death experience, I was pretty depressed. I rode this high for a while, and being really thankful to be alive. And then reality started setting in. I had this like new way of thinking and being in the world that was really challenging. And I didn't really have like a lot of support, people that could understand that stuff, right? And I really didn't know where to look. Like I remember my junior year, I really attached to a lot of the existential writers and philosophers because there's something there around like the meaningless of life. And I think I was attaching to that because I came back again, like riding this high. And then probably like, after my sophomore year, I was just like, this is all bullshit. Like, I don't want to spend my time doing half this stuff that doesn't mean anything. Like, I'd rather be doing other things. And so I think I really kind of appreciated some of those early existential writers because it helped me kind of like, I don't know, deal with some of the existential despair I was feeling. And I think a lot of people maybe don't always talk about like these deep valleys after transformative experiences. That it got really, really dark. There were a lot of times I just wanted to go back to that blissed out state. And so there's kind of a lot of suicidal ideation around there of going like, I just want to return to that place that I call home. And so when I came across psilocybin, I kind of took it. We always talk about set and setting, the importance of being in a good mindset and being in a good environment. I was out in the woods and I kind of took it with this mentality that I kind of just wanted to escape a little bit, just because of like all the deep, dark things that were going on in my mind at the time. And so I went out into the woods with my friend. We went hiking, and I think it took about 2 grams of cubensis. And we were walking, and I watched my friend puke his up, and I was like, "Oh man, like maybe I don't know if this is a good sign." By this time, I felt like my body was dissolving, and I was just trying to grasp on any little thing about reality. And I remember it just kept kind of coming in waves. Like 1 minute I could grasp onto reality, the next minute it was just like sand falling through my hands and going like, what is going on right now? So after seeing my friend puke his up, um, we started walking a little bit more, and we were on this little trail in the woods, and I found this little rock, and I remember pointing at it and thinking, I'm gonna die on this rock right now. And so I sat on this rock, and things started to get pretty dark. I started to get that cold feeling. Um, I felt like there is this sense of death around me, and this sense that this feels very familiar. Um, and then all of a sudden, the world started to have teeth. All the plants and trees around me had all these mouths, and I just kind of start. This is considered a bad trip if you ever heard about. Like this is what they portray in movies, and so it was like the world kind of consumed me at this point, and I entered into this state of not knowing anything. I didn't know my name. I didn't know what year it was. I was trying to remember who I was. I was trying to remember what I did for work. I couldn't remember what year it was. I thought I was like doing one thing when it was a totally different year, and I was doing something else, and I was really just trying to grasp on to who is Kyle and where am I in this space-time continuum. Like I have no idea what year it is, what's going on. And that was really scary. And I remember being in this like black void of nothingness going like, who am I? What is going on right now? And then I started to have this, I guess, like spiritual experience where I started to leave my body more. And I describe it as like I was traveling through like space and these star systems. And I came to the edge of the universe and started peering back into my own mind. And there are these little entities in there. I that image is burned in my head, and I know what they look like. And it was terrifying. I go, "Phew, I don't want to know that these things exist. Like, how the hell do I go back to normal reality knowing that these things are real?" But when I got there, there was a part of me I said, wait a minute. I feel like I've been here before. And these things said, thousands of times. And I said, okay, this is weird. I feel like I've been here thousands of times. This feels like I'm dead. Maybe I'm in some sort of death bardo. And so I said, is this what this is? And they said, more or less so. And at this point, I'm just confronting this trickster archetype. Like they're not giving me a yes or no. They're just keep telling me more or less so. And I think, so I started kind of doing this like analytical thinking and this going, okay, if X, this equals this, I'm like, okay, if I've been here thousands of times, this could be a place where I went when I died. Maybe this is like the place where I went when I was kind of drifting off. Then maybe this is maybe this is what God is. Maybe this is these entities, whatever I talk to, and this is what gave me this new way of knowing and seeing the world. So I asked that question, and of course I was confronted with more or less so. And at that point, I think my friend snapped me out of it, and I remember hearing, "Just breathe, man. Just breathe." And I remember taking this huge breath of air, and I found myself back on the trail and back in my body. And but I remember coming out of that and going, that was so familiar of death. And the whole trip made a turn. Everything was like just beautiful. It felt like I was reborn to some degree, and it was really, really, really profound. But so after that whole trip ended, I came away thinking, how could I ingest this substance that reminded me and could reproduce this near death like experience? And that became just a fascinating question. I didn't know anything really about the science of psychedelics. I didn't really have any context besides my friends making jokes in high school, like, you may eat these and see pink elephants or something like that. Like, I didn't really have a lot of context for what that experience was. And so that really kind of got me on this path to wanting to explore it a little bit more intellectually. So, people always ask, like, what did you think about that experience? Was that real? I don't really know. I could tear it apart in a lot of different ways. The whole teeth and mouth thing is really interesting because if you look at, say, a lot of anthropological reports around what's called like the shamanic illness or crisis or kind of any sort of initiation, sometimes they talk about you leaving this world or the world consuming you, and these spirits like, just dissecting you and tearing you into like a million pieces and putting you back together again. And that's really interesting. I didn't know anything about that until I started kind of studying shamanism a little bit more and reading about some of these anthropological points of view and these stories. From the entity stuff, we could look at it as, could this be tapping into something in the collective unconscious? Could I have just like had contact with these archetypal beings, which I would say that was the trickster. This was a total trickster energy and archetype. Um, on the other hand, did my psyche need to reproduce something to give me some sort of answer around my near death experience? Because I didn't have, say, the traditional near death experience where I was going down a tunnel of light. I made this decision to come back. I was meeting these angels, or sometimes people say they're ancestors or some sort of light being. I didn't have that. After I woke up from my accident, I felt like I went somewhere. I felt like I talked to something, and I didn't have any sort of visual context for it. I just had this deep, deep, deep sense of knowing in my bones that something really profound happened, and I couldn't do it. And so when I think about psychedelics, we talk about psychedelics from how Dr. Stanislav Grof defines them as non-specific amplifiers of mental or psychic processes. And so when I think about that, I go, okay, I had this process unfolding. I'm trying to figure out a bunch of these and like, yeah, trying to explore these questions and find some answers. And so is that what my psyche needed to just relive? It needed to reproduce an experience that reminded me of dying and death and provided kind of like this entity type of contact to give me some sort of context of like what the hell happened when I went through that near death experience. And so yeah, there's lots of ways to view it. I don't have a solid answer on it. I try to remain open and curious around what that experience was, but it did change my life, and it was really profound.
Yeah, it's hard to say whether or not these experiences are quote unquote real, but it also doesn't really matter in most contexts, especially within like the therapeutic context. So it seems to me like obviously there are very many benefits that a person could have from taking a psychedelic and being able to address, some inner issues, maybe some past stuff, some things that they have to get over within themselves and maybe their life, their emotional content, and things of that nature. But it seems to me that when the rubber meets the road is that mystical experience, that experience of something that, like you said, sort of feels like God, but you can't put a finger on it. You really don't know what it is because words can't describe it. Do you feel like the biggest therapeutic breakthroughs take place within those types of experiences?
It's interesting. This is like a question that I think researchers are starting to explore. And so I was just at a conference up here in Vermont at Stowe. And I think it was Dr. Matt Johnson and Dr. Chuck Razan. I forget his last name is how to pronounce it. There was a few people talking about the mystical quality of psychedelic experiences, and do you need that for therapeutic outcome? And so I think this is still left up to debate. And I just did a webinar today um, with Dr. Bruno Gomez, who has been working with Ibogaine down in Brazil. And something that he mentioned today that like I haven't really heard about was that typically in some of the clients that he sees, people don't always have these profound visionary experiences. So sometimes people feel really dizzy or they have like a little bit of insight, but they don't have that like mystical experience, but people are still getting better. And so if you asked me this a few years ago, I probably would have been pretty biased and said, yes, you need to have like this spiritual, mystical type experience. But I'm also trying to be a little bit more open minded and hear around some of the research and how other people are kind of explaining these experiences. And, you know, are people having similar kind of therapeutic outcome? And it sounded like from what Dr. Gomez was saying today that in the case of Ibogaine, that seems to be the case with some people. Um, this one research study that's I guess it's taking place or about to take place is that they're going to start administering psilocybin to those who are asleep, and I forget how they're going to induce sleep, whether that's through like anesthesia uh, to kind of shut off the brain. And and then administer psychedelics to see if there's actual benefit. And so, would we see that if somebody is quote unquote unconscious? And then, so does that lend more to the theory of like brain chemistry? I don't know, but to some degree, being trained in transpersonal psychology, having lots of transpersonal experiences, I would say that from my biased approach, that it does seem pretty important. Because those experiences, I think, help provide a little bit of context with what's going on, right? And so, just thinking about, I had this trauma from this near death experience, a lot of kind of psycho spiritual trauma to work through, and I had a lot of questions. And with this experience, it provided some sort of visual context to make sense of my near death experience. And could I have gotten better to some degree without that? Maybe, like maybe I could have had a different type of experience and would have felt better. Um, I'm just thinking about that one experience that was very profound, and it helped to actually create a new type of narrative in my mind where I felt at ease and I didn't have to ask so many questions. There was like this just, oh, I get it now. It's okay. Maybe I don't need to know everything. I don't need to spend time just trying to figure it out. So it did provide a little bit of like substance there. But I don't know. Yeah, it'd be interesting to ask others too, where they've gotten the most benefit from with psychedelics. Was it just like deep psychological insight? Because yeah, that amplification process, people can have clearer thoughts. Sometimes old memories emerge, and is that always a mystical experience? And so that's an interesting question. How does one define a mystical experience? You could look at like the MEQ, what they use to study and rate mystical experiences, but like, that comes from this research world. But how do you define a mystical experience? Could I define a mystical experience of reliving my birth trauma? That's more kind of, I don't know, biological to some degree, and it's has nothing to do with maybe merging with the oneness of the universe, where you might kind of say that was a mystical experience. And so, yeah, what creates the change? I think there's a lot of debate there in the psychedelic world, and it's interesting.
And I'm sure it depends on, what modality you choose, whether that's, psilocybin, whether you're trying to participate in an ayahuasca retreat, and then there's always breath work, which
Hmm.
it's something that I still haven't tried yet. And I don't know, I'm
We'll
sort
get
of
you
in.
to a workshop
Yes,
someday.
yes. I want to do one of the Dream Shadow workshops. I think there was one that was in Pennsylvania that I missed.
We have one coming up. I don't think you missed it.
Oh, coming up.
We had to cancel it. Yeah, but we do have one in Philly coming up in September.
Oh, that's perfect. I'm like very close to Philly. All right.
Sweet.
Yeah, send me that link then when we get off recording so I
Yeah.
can sign up for that for sure.
Yeah.
But speaking of breath work, so I understand that you've had breathwork experiences that are on par with psilocybin, ayahuasca type experiences. And for someone who hasn't tried breathwork, it seems almost unbelievable. So is that really dependent on like the particular technique you do? Because there's always like the Wim Hof methods, which are methods that seem to be like a practice that's done daily or even multiple times a day. But you wouldn't want to necessarily get yourself into a psychedelic state multiple times a day. So, what's kind of the method of getting yourself to those places?
Yeah, so like the Dream Shadow transpersonal breathwork comes out of the lineage. My teachers were trained by Stan and Christina Groff, so they were the ones that developed holotropic breathwork. And Dr. Stan Groff is a pioneer in LSD and psychedelic research. For those that don't know his name, and so when the research became illegal, he found himself over in Esalen, and he was a scholar in residence, kind of going through all of his notes and writing. And him and his wife at the time created this breathing technique that seemed to foster these holotropic states of consciousness. And so, yeah, I think when people think of breath work, they think of Wim Hof, maybe yogic or meditation styles of breath work. This form of breath work, there's five components. There's intensified breathing, evocative music, group process, focused body work, and expressive art. And so what we do is really kind of set the container up for deep inner exploration. So people will usually pair up with somebody, and we talk about it as a breather sitter pair. So somebody is breathing, another person's sitting with you. You have the facilitators all around. We're in a big room, very low light to almost dark, to kind of create that more internal ambiance. People wear eye shades, and then we play loud music, and then we encourage people to intensify their breathing. And the breath is just a vehicle, right? Psychedelics are a vehicle and a tool. Breath is a vehicle and a tool. And coming from, I guess, with Dream Shadow and what Lenny has kind of passed on, is that there's this amplification process with psychedelics and with breath work. And again, if we think of it as a tool or a vehicle, how do we set that container up to really go deep? And so I think the combination of all those, the intensified breathing, the evocative music, the body work, the group process, etc., helps to create that setting to go inside. And what happens when the psyche gets amplified? A lot of stuff can show up. So I think some people. I was very skeptical when I heard this. I stumbled across breath work when I was doing my undergrad in transpersonal psychology. That they had a one credit weekend workshop, and everybody was telling me how psychedelic it was, and I was like, I don't know about that. And I went down and had a really, really, really profound experience. You don't always see that right off the bat with people. I think if you're like attuned and your psyche is ready to process that stuff, you'll go deep, right? And so I'm somebody that had a near death experience. I've had a lot of these psychedelic experiences early on. I felt primed for that, right? I think if somebody maybe doesn't have those experiences and they don't have that context, they may not classify it as like that was a psychedelic trip, right? Because you don't maybe have that experience to riff off of and go, yeah, that was really similar to my psilocybin experience. Um, so again, I always come back to a lot of this is inside of us, and we just have these different tools to amplify that process and go inside. So whether that is psychedelics, whether that's breath work, there's something core there. And I don't really know how to define that core experience. The flavors are different, but it's almost like a similar core, right? It's like, psychedelics, they get you to this spot where it's like, I don't know, we'll call it like your higher self, or like, getting in touch with the universe in a way. It's like, oh, I can feel that I have this higher self. I feel this authentic part of myself I can connect with that has this relationship with the universe. That makes sense. You can get there in breathwork and psychedelics. But yeah, maybe the psychedelics, they give you a little bit of the glimmer, and other things are happening. But to me, there's like this core experience that feels very similar across modalities. I mean, if you look at rites of passages, right? I mean, there's so many different ways that humans have altered their consciousness and talked about very similar experiences. Again, the flavor might be a little different, but I think there is something central to these experiences that humans can induce.
Yeah, it seems that our culture is not primed for these experiences and we don't have the correct context in which to understand them. But it does seem that shamanic cultures do, or they seem to have at least some sort of a framework where they've been working on a map. And I think it was Terrence McKenna who would say that while we were over here working with like atom smashers and metal equipment, the shamanic cultures for thousands of years were trying to map the psyche and map
Yeah.
the otherworldly realms. How do we merge or accept or sort of integrate, to use that word again, the indigenous models into our own culture?
It's a great question. And I know it's a question people ask pretty often, especially within like how do you incorporate the indigenous use within even like the clinical setting. Um, this is a tricky question too, because when we ask this question, it can sometimes lead to cultural appropriation, right? So just taking from other one's culture and appropriating it. And so when I think about this question, I think, how do we understand and listen to these various cosmologies and belief systems, and kind of understand the map and the territory, but also think about the culture that we live in as well. I kind of sometimes will use this analogy when we talk about ayahuasca shamanism, and that's the cosmic serpent or the jaguar is not in the concrete jungle, right? Like we're dealing with way different like kind of cultures and lifestyles. And so when we think about that, um, when you have an experience, think about what is it that makes that unique to you, and how do we also really respect and honor where these medicines come from, listen to the people that have had plenty of experience and have built cosmologies around these experiences, and try to understand it. But do we always need to sit there and pull from it and say, this is exactly what it is all the time, right? Because I feel like our culture, we live in a totally different world. And so this is a very, very delicate balance at times. And so I think another example that I think about is like, so I during my transpersonal psychology degree, I studied a little bit of like shamanic practices with a teacher. His name's Michael, and he's part Cherokee Lakota and European ancestry. And I think he found out about some of his Native American ancestry later on in life. He wasn't always connected with it, and so I think he had a little bit of a later go at doing these practices. And I think he taught me a lot of stuff, and I've spent some time with other elders. And what do I like? How have I been incorporating that? And so I'm trained in like mostly Western thought, right? That's where I live, and so I think like where's the shared commonality, where's like the shared narrative there, and thinking about like what's the difference between like shamanism and counseling at times. So obviously there's a difference, but there's sometimes some crossover there. And how do I guess also understand my cultural narrative and think about how it could also some of those maybe shamanic qualities weave into that. I'm not going to dress up as somebody that's Native American. That stuff doesn't really like that's not my culture, right? So how do you respect other people's cultures, learn from them, get permission to maybe understand how to integrate that in, but not just taking from it, exploiting it, and trying to then make it your own at times, if that makes sense, right? Like, I mean, you do see a lot of people with like, headdresses and stuff like that, and they just want to embody that worldview, and that could be really offensive for people that are from indigenous lineages, where it's like you didn't spend much time with these people, you don't understand their culture. I remember the first time I did ayahuasca, like I can understand it reading about it so much. The experience itself actually felt very familiar, and there's something like, oh yeah, I know this. But I remember having this thought of like, I know nothing about this plant. Like, I don't live in the jungle. I haven't had a deep relationship with it, like some like these folks. I mean, the shaman started drinking ayahuasca when he was 12, right? And he's growing up around the plant. They're living in a totally different world than I am. And so I think we just have to like really think about that, and be honest, be respectful, honor where it comes from, but also know our own limitations. Like, I would probably die in the jungle, so I'm not going to pretend I need to be living in the jungle doing this stuff all the time. I thought when I was younger I would wanted to do that. I'm like, oh, that'd be awesome. I don't know, maybe life will take me there, and I'll learn, but that's not my reality. And I think we just have to be honest about that. But I don't know, I'm curious if you have any thoughts about that as well.
To me, it seems that, like you were saying, the crossover. I think one of the most basic crossover points that we can get across would just be nature and our relationship
Yeah.
with nature. If we could just learn something from them, about how they interact with nature, not bastardizing and um, approaching it in a way where it's like us against nature. We are animals and we are the earth, we are the universe, and I think that that number one lesson right there would be something that could really transform the way that we think about all transpersonal experiences as well. But I think another really big part of this is, like you said, respecting the culture and respecting where these things come from. And nowadays, like I just saw a news article not long ago, and it was like on Apple News. It just came up, popped up on my phone, and it said why billionaires are smoking toad venom. And
Yeah.
that along with like the abuse of peyote, it seems that we have an issue with the conservation of nature. So,
Yeah.
I mean, where do you see that going?
I think it's really interesting. I know Joe has talked about this on the podcast and stuff. He lives in Colorado, and I think he's closer connected to the Southwest. And I think that's a question to ask oneself: of do I engage in a practice where some of these plants are at risk, right? And peyote being one of them. And those conservation efforts are needed, right? Like, and it's not just say like over harvesting and this and that. That's probably an issue. People poaching lands and stealing peyote buttons, and takes a long time for that to produce. But we also have to think about like the ecosystems and how delicate ecosystems are, and if we do believe and can come to terms that climate change is happening, right? How is that going to change the landscape over time, right? And I think it brings up an interesting thing of like who gets to like have these medicines. Um, and I remember there was somebody that was part of a culture that uses peyote, and there seems to also be a difference within generational differences where the elder in the community said it should only be reserved for their culture and their people, and then the younger person in the same community was saying, well, this is medicine for everybody, right? um I think we do really need to be honest about these conservation efforts and sustainability, because what happens if, yeah, I mean, some of these plants do go extinct, and that was very embedded in somebody's religious and cultural beliefs and cosmology, and they don't have access to that. So I don't know. I'm always kind of conscious about that, and think about like, yeah, should I be participating? I think if you are invited to a ceremony by somebody that is authentic and from that culture, like, is that always a bad thing? I don't think so. There probably is that time and place for that, but think about like what you could be doing. So, like, for example, with the toad. We had some colleagues and 5-MeO researchers create this little sticker and art thing, and I think they slapped it on a T-shirt, and we had it up on our shop. But it says, "Save a toad, exploit a chemist." And so, if you are wanting to maybe try 5-MeO DMT, could you find somebody that's using synthetic 5-MeO? Does it always need to come from the toad? If you are interested in peyote, could you also try San Pedro or maybe synthetic mescaline? And obviously you'll get into some of these like more nuanced things around like, well, the spirit of peyote is different than the spirit of San Pedro, or like synthetic 5-MeO isn't the same as smoking toad. Um, but I think again, like thinking about like conservation is important, and it's just something to be aware of, that we do live on a finite planet, yeah, spaceship Earth, as Bucky Fuller liked to say, right? And this probably wasn't a problem when a lot of these medicines were just used in small populations, right? Wasn't being over harvested, wasn't the demand wasn't there, and so we have to think about consumer demand now, especially as psychedelics start to become more mainstream. I mean, just in a few weeks of this recording, we're recording on June 27th here. I think it's July 12th. A new Netflix documentary is coming out, How to Change Your Mind, about Michael Pollan's book. And what type of impact is that going to have on culture at large? I mean, his book had much impact, but a Netflix series, I think it's a 4-part series, that's going to reach a lot more people. And like, are people going to be interested in seeking out these medicines? And so, if you are, just also think about maybe the conservation efforts. Again, today on this webinar we were hosting about iboga, the presenter was also bringing up the conservation efforts for iboga. Uh, iboga can't be exported from Gabon. I think they said it's like a national treasury, and so they're also thinking about like what are other plants that they could create extractions of ibogaine out of. Are there any other substitutes there? And so yeah, it's an important conversation and also very nuanced. And I know people have different opinions, and so I think it's like, how dogmatic do we get around, say, I need to take this plant because of the spirit in there, right? I think when Albert Hoffman synthesized psilocybin or psilocin and brought it to Maria Sabina said, "Oh, this is great. I can use this when the mushrooms aren't in season." She did make a comment around it not having its spirit, but again, like, what are you using these substances for? What are you looking for? It really kind of comes back to intention. Can you do some similar deep work with another compound that like isn't having a big impact on the environment and just be as beneficial? So I don't know, just some things to think about and just to be more aware of. I'm not giving any I don't want to give any hard answers of what somebody should or shouldn't do.
Yes, definitely important things to think about as we move forward. And well, as we move toward the end of this conversation here, I understand you have a call you have to get to pretty shortly. Is there anything else you'd like to cover, or any events or anything like that you'd like to plug?
Um, Events? I mean, just yeah, if anybody wants to check out what we're doing here at Psychedelics Today, you can check that out at psychedelicstoday.com. We just launched a new program called Vital, which is a 12-month program. And you can check out more at vitalpsychedelictraining.com. That new cohort isn't launching until next April, so April of 2023, but you can get on the wait list there and stay up to date around applications. And I mean, I think the other thing that maybe we didn't touch on is just around integration, right? And that's always a fun topic. And I think, again, like highlighting the fact that this podcast came from an integration project, which is, so cool to, now come back and be part of it. So, I just want to congratulate you on, your success there of actually manifesting it. And it's so cool to watch that and be part of it. But the importance of really sitting with your experience. And I always think like, how many times do we need to be going into that realm? There was this I was having this conversation with an anthropologist. I think she was an anthropologist. I forget her training and background, but she was saying that in some tribes that she studied with, they would only drink ayahuasca when they really needed it. And I said, "Well, why was that?" And she said, because it opened up their community to different things, right? It was like that energy could come into the community. And so, really thinking about like, what are we getting out of these experiences? Do we always need to keep going back in there? And I think it was Jeremy Narby when we had him on our podcast. He said ayahuasca can give you like 10 years worth of content. And do you always need to be stirring the pot all the time? Or can you really sit there and cultivate something from all that content? And I think that's important to think about as, again, like psychedelics start become more mainstream. And I think this really comes from my own experiences of chasing and seeking those answers. Really kind of getting caught up in, if I just do it one more time, I'm going to know the secrets of the universe, right? And it's like, what are we getting from these experiences, and how do we bring them down into our bodies, into this 3D reality, and really kind of plant some seeds and start to do the work. I think I got caught up in that really early on, and I kept bumping up against the same answers. And I finally got to this point of going, well, if I'm not making any changes in my real life, then what's actually changing? Why am I constantly chasing these experiences if I'm not actually doing the work here? And so, just something to consider and think about as people start to move into this work. Like, how can you really not solely focus on the medicine experience or drug experience? It's just one part, right? There's so much more that goes into it, and just to think about that as well.
Yeah, there's a reason that we come back to this default everyday waking mode of consciousness. And I think that any experience outside of that should inform the way that we act here and now. So And Kyle, I really appreciate you coming on today, man. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This has been really fun and I appreciate it. And thank you everybody for sticking around and listening.